What do you do? So anyway, things came to a head with a very interesting case there, where I realised that what we were dealing with was that these people had no intention of regulating their constituency. I won't name the name because the man sues, and he is still a litigious so-and-so. But it's a very well-known firm of financial intermediaries down in Bristol, who regularly appear on. You'll regularly hear them referred to on the radio. They're constantly being referred to as somebody that you can talk to if you're stupid enough about your financial affairs. I did a number on this particular company because I had a very nice lady who wrote to me, and she said, I've been investing with Mr. So-and-so and so-and-so. She said, I've invested my entire pension. She was a teacher. I've invested my entire pension with him. She said, he tells me he's invested it in 4 lots of unit trusts. But she said, I've got a contract note from him, but I can never seem to get my certificates, my unit trust certificates. Well, those of you, anybody here will know, without the certificate from the unit trust company, you have no proof that you've invested. And she was desperate. I'll cut the story short. I did a big investigation into him. I eventually got some help from Commercial Union, funnily enough. And I was able to prove that what he did was he would take money in from clients, he would purchase very large quantities of unit trusts on paper, and he had a backstairs deal with the unit trust companies. He'd purchase them, but he wouldn't pay for them. But he would take the client's money and he'd put it on deposit in his bank, and he would leave it like that for 6 months. So all the time he was earning interest of substantial millions of pounds, while all the time his clients were actually at huge risk, because if anything had happened and he'd gone down, they would have had not a leg to stand on. So I put an investigation paper up to the committee, suggesting that in fact he'd be disciplined for not being fit and proper and for breaches of all kinds of client money rules, and I also suggested that he should be prosecuted, and that I was going to report him to the police to be prosecuted for offences under the Theft Act. It didn't come as much of a surprise to me to realise that night my office was burgled. And the member of the committee, who was a big friend of this particular chap, stole my report on him. He wasn't actually a very clever man, because he stole the report I left out for him to steal, because I knew he would. And I adopted it so that it could only be one copy of the report. And of course I left it out for him to steal, and he stole it. And he then sent it to this company, and whereupon they started to use it to basically box and cocks, and they got in touch with their friends in the press. And the usual stories started coming out, how awful it was. These chaps were trying to do their business, and they were just being held back by these damned regulators who were indulging in policing tactics. Of course, nothing happened, and he's still in business today, making a fortune. I think he should have been behind bars, but that's another issue. The big changeover in the city, which of course took place, if you remember the Big Bang of 1986, what it did effectively was it moved Britain from being a country that was used to dealing in one methodology, and it moved us completely into a whole new style of commercial dealings. What we did was we moved from what was known as dealing in a single capacity basis. So chaps in the city who are worked on a single capacity basis, and they now moved over to deal in an American style. They were now dealing in a dual capacity basis. They were becoming brokers and jobbers in their own right. And at one stage in my interviews, I interviewed Sir Peter Tapsell. Does anybody know of Sir Peter Tapsell? Yeah. He's the father of the House of Commons. He's still there. Yeah. But a very, very leading stockbroker, and in fairness to him, a very, very nice man. And he agreed to see me when I interviewed him. And I asked him about this whole business about moving from single capacity to dual capacity. and on the abolition of fixed commissions. And he said this, he said, I immediately pointed out there would be very large-scale repercussions from that decision, but it was denied from the Treasury bench by ministers. Oh no, they said, we are only interested in getting rid of minimum commissions. We want the separation of functions to continue in the stock exchange. And he then says, I don't think even the Council of the Stock Exchange appreciated that if you abolished minimum commissions, it was extremely unlikely that the separation of functions could survive. He said there would not be sufficient profit to be made unless firms started to deal on their own account, which hitherto they had been strictly prohibited from so doing, because it posed a conflict of interest. And that is why city firms since God knows when had not been allowed to have this conflict of interest, because it was so dangerous. So they either dealt for the client or they dealt for the firm who wanted to sell the stock. But they couldn't do both. And this is what Mrs. Thatcher's new changes brought in. And he said they would then have to follow the American example and start speculating on their own account. And this is where, when you hear this word speculating, you are beginning to hear another word coming into the language of banking. Is what we refer to today as proprietary trading. Trading on the account of the bank. So you hire traders and brokers and young traders to basically sit in the bank, playing with the bank's money, betting on, you name it, making money for the bank itself. And once you take that process, once you embed that process inside a banking institution, you start to remove banks from their traditional function. And you turn them into casinos, which is, of course, the phrase that many people have been using. Later, I spoke to Sir Peter again, and he was talking about the invasion of American methods. And he said to me this, he said he was very worried about it by this time. And these are his words. Now think about this, this is in 1986. And think about what's happening today. He said, I suspect we shall lurch from scandal to scandal as a result of moving into dual capacity, particularly as it is to be internationalised. Whether in the long run the general community will be well served by having these new huge financial conglomerates, where you get retail banks, merchant investment banks and foreign banks all mixed in together with a British stockbroking firm, I very much doubt. I think it's going to be very difficult to regulate. I think the authority of the Bank of England will be greatly undermined. I think a great many of the people who will be operating in future will have different traditions from those of my generation. And I think you will get a lot of scandals. And when these scandals break, my party, the Conservative Party, will be held responsible for them. He said that in 1986. Boy, is he right. A very perspicacious man. And the important thing is that what we're now seeing is that the old rules by which our markets had been traditionally operated completely changed now. It's now every man for himself. Fascinating report this morning in the Daily Telegraph for those of you who read that scandal rag, probably not very many of you, but a wonderful report there how a city gentleman called Mr. Anthony Saltz has written a major report on the way in which Barclays Bank conducted themselves. And of course, being a member of the establishment, Mr. Saltz has given them a very, very, very hard slap on the wrists. But what he's been saying is he's talking about the changing culture. And it is this word culture that more and more starts to identify and look at what's been going on inside the banking community. The changes whereby the old rules, if you like, of looking after the interests of investors, the old rules have now been completely superseded. And the interesting thing is, you see, that excuse me, the British culture, financial culture, is not used. We weren't used in those days to dealing in securities. Think back, how many of you can remember, remembering your grandparents, if you can still do that. how many of them would ever have thought about buying stocks and shares? Yours would have done?
Well, one of my grandparents was an aristocrat, and the other one of my grandparents was an international business person.
So, perfectly reasonably, he might have done.
Well, what was a woman? My grandmother ran a firm at the age of 70.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about
That's okay. It's perfectly... It's good to know that there are some people who might have done it.
that. Yeah.
But my point is that almost ubiquitously, the British ordinary man and woman in the street did not deal in securities. In fact, what most of them did, because most British working people didn't have enough disposable income to start investing in securities. And if they did anything at all, they saved. And they tended to save with, anybody think back?
Refuge assurance.
Refuge assurance, building societies. Building societies. Go back a little bit more.
Oh, mutual societies. Or something
Mutual
like that.
societies. They started to put the odd penny and tuppence a week away with insurance companies. The man from the Prue, who came round your house every Friday evening and collected that tuppence that went into your book.
Yes.
And the purpose of those policies was to do what?
To bury you.
Well done, madam. To bury yourself with dignity. That is how the working class saved enough money to avoid the ignominy of the pauper's grave. And from those days, the British method of investment and saving money began to grow. And as you've said, mutual societies grew up, which eventually became building societies, and all the rest of it. The point being that our tradition of dealing in investment products was completely different from our American cousins. But suddenly we're being hit around the chops by all these American methods. I've got to be conscious of the time. I've got another, 15, 20 minutes? Having worked in the regulatory regime, of course, by the end of the late 90s, moving towards 2000, eventually it became clear that the alphabet soup that had been set up to regulate the city wasn't working. It was just failing. And so, consequently, rather than continue with this by now very, very much completely discredited method of regulation, we did what the British are so good at. We basically picked it all up, put it in a bag, and chucked it in the bin, and created another one overnight. We took all the same people who had been working in the much discredited industry and moved them into new jobs. And we moved from the SIB, we now moved to a thing called the FSA, the Financial Services Authority. And the Financial Services Authority, of course, was going to be the answer to every problem. It was going to be the answer to a Virgin's prayer. And indeed, this was definitely going to be the way forward. But I remember going to interview. I was invited by the Treasury to do an interview with the FSA about. Sorry, forgive me. I'm just looking for a reference. I was invited by the Treasury to go and actually do an interview with somebody in the FSA looking into the way in which the City of London was being used to launder money. Because money laundering had by then, had by then become quite a significant issue. And I went in to interview these chaps at the FSA, and it hadn't yet come into its own, but it was going to have criminal powers now, which it was felt they needed, in order to regulate the banking communities. And they were given statutory authority to deal with what was called financial crime. It's the first time this phrase was really enunciated. And they were given these powers, and those financial crimes included insider trading, market manipulation, and money laundering. And they were given these powers by Parliament and powers to prosecute. So I went along to talk to these chaps, and I interviewed this chap from the SIB who was going to get into the new FSA. And I asked him about, what are you going to do about these new prosecution powers you've got? And he agreed that the FSA would become responsible for a greater degree of responsibility for prosecution. But he said this, he said, there is an anxiety. It's the civil servant speak, it's wonderful. They use these wonderful mellifluous. There's an anxiety about the new criminal functions which we're being tasked to accept. Various elements, such as insider dealing, market manipulation, money laundering, all tend to colour our internal philosophy towards the question of conducting prosecutions. You really should understand, this is addressed to me, because of the difficulties associated with obtaining convictions in the criminal courts, there is no unswerving acceptance of the need for wholesale prosecution powers.
What does that mean? Sorry.
It means we're not going to do anything about it. It means that Parliament's given them these powers, but frankly, they decided they weren't going to play with them. And I said to him, I said in my report, the answer was given in such an open way. This is my report to the Commission, telling them what the FSA had said all those years ago. I'm saying to them, they ain't prosecuting anybody, and they've had this right from the start. This answer was given in such an open way, in contrast to so many other of the answers he gave. I invited him to state why he was so sure this was the case. He said this to me. He said, because frankly, Howard Davis, who was then the head of the putative FSA, because Howard Davis has no intention of ending up with the sort of reputation which so bedevilled the SFO, the Serious Fraud Office, in its early days, he refuses to be tarred with the same brush as Barbara Mills or George Staple. So all those years ago, they decided, no matter what Parliament says, no matter what we the people want, they weren't going to do anything about it. And they have done nothing about it ever since. I can't believe that, you've all been sitting here watching what's been going on in some of these cases and not asking yourself the question, why is nobody being investigated? Everybody's been asking this question. The head of the Parliamentary Commission himself was asking the question, why has nobody been investigated for fraud? Let's talk about mis-selling. What is mis-selling? Anybody tell me, what is mis-selling? Well, what is it actually? What is it in practice?
It's lying about the product.
It's
lying about the product.
Do you misrepresent yourself in some way?
Lying about the product.
No, it's theft.
Theft. Yeah. You go to a bank to get a loan for perfectly good reasons, and they say to you, we think it'd be awfully nice. Or, in fact, in some cases, we require you. We require you to take out an insurance policy so that if anything happens to you in the course of the repayment, the insurance policy will kick in and will continue the payments. Hands up here, who's going to say that's a bad idea? It's not, is it? It's a great idea. If you can afford it. It's a great idea. You have this insurance policy that if anything happens to you, if you get out of work, you break a leg, you get sick, the insurance policy will carry on paying off your loan. Except what they didn't tell you was, it wouldn't. It didn't work for you, it didn't apply to you, and it was never going to pay off your loan. What they took from you was your money on the basis of a lie. A bloody great big lie. Now, my friends, please take it from me. When you solicit somebody to part with their money, and you lie to them about the purpose for which this solicitation is made, so much so that it acts upon their mind and they part with their money because they believe you, and it turns out that it's not true. There's a very simple word for that. It's called fraud. And hundreds of thousands, well, perhaps not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of second-hand car dealers have been routinely prosecuted for that. Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of, I'm afraid to say, and sad to say, single women, single mothers, who've made false claims for benefit, but who haven't told the benefit agency about their boyfriend, about the man who lives with them. They haven't told him about that. And therefore they are then said to be obtaining benefit by deception, because they're required to tell the agency. And they go to prison. And their children get taken into care for doing just that thing. I recently went on to Google, and I Googled banking crime prosecutions, and then I Googled single parents, benefit fraud, boom-de-boom, and got them down. In the benefit fraud cases, prison. No. Nothing. I personally, I'm sorry, there may be people who think, well, you shouldn't have claimed benefit and not tell the state about your lover. And maybe you should. And maybe it is a crime. And if Parliament says it's a crime, as far as I'm concerned, it is a crime. But I think there are ways of dealing with it that don't have to involve prison. I don't think women should be in prison for reaching out just to seek a bit of ordinary human warmth and comfort, just because they've had the misfortune to end up in a situation which I don't suppose any of them wanted to end up in the first place. And I think that's for me, that's a leitmotif of our society. I don't want to get too involved in all that, I get angry. But now we have the FSA controlling the financial sector. One of our biggest problems was that, sadly, for those of us who are of the, perhaps more of the, I don't know what the word is. What's the word I'm looking for? I hate to say the left.
Egalitarian.
Thank you. That's the lovely word. Thank you. I don't consider myself of the left, in the sense that Phil and I have been discussing today. I consider myself to be a free thinker. But the problem for us was that this coincided with the same time as the Labour government with Brown and Blair, who came in and who basically gave the city its head. And Blair didn't, I don't think Blair cared. I don't think Blair was interested. I think he was far too busy invading Iraq and doing those sort of things. But Gordon Brown never got it. He believed what the city told him. The Labour Party always has. The Labour Party has always fallen for the city's lies. And they told him, oh, just hands off, Gordon. Leave us alone and we'll continue to bring in the money. And they were bringing in money. Nowhere near as much as they should have been, but he left them alone. And in those years, they cemented their own hegemony. And to finish this off, we got to a situation where at the end, what you and I had known originally as banking had long since ceased to be banking. That in the old days, if you wanted to borrow money from a bank, I can remember this. I remember trying to get my first mortgage, and I was told by the chap at Woolwich, the Woolwich Building Society, he said, well, I couldn't possibly lend you any money. You haven't been investing, you haven't been saving with us for at least 4 years. My parents had, but that wasn't good enough. In the old days, when a bank manager or an institutional manager who was going to lent you money, he had to stand behind the debt. He had to ensure that you were morally, financially, and in every other which way suitable person to be able to give that money to in the sure and certain knowledge that you would repay it. Because it was his career on the line, it was his reputation on the line if he ended up with too many bad debts. Because he was lending you money that his institution had put aside for lending purposes. It was, if you want to use a silly phrase, it's a bloody silly phrase, but real money. It was on the books of his institution, and he was standing behind it. But of course, what happened was, in the last 10, 15, 10, 12 years, of course, we suddenly moved from talking about real money. There's no such phrase. I just use this as a because, I mean, you will all know the word real money means nothing. It's irrelevant. But I'm talking now about fantasy money, where you go to an institution for a loan, and that institution is falling over backwards to give you this money because they're now being measured on the number of loans they make because of the commission they're making. And they give you a loan, and you take the money. But what happens, this isn't money off their book. They then take that debt, and they reverse the polarity, and they turn it into an asset. And they package it all together, and they securitize it, and they sell it on to somebody else. So that debt that's on their book, that debt from you, sir, has now been securitized. It's turned into an asset and sold to this good lady, who in turn sells it on to this gentleman. And these things went all over the place like a virus. And these debts, these repackaged debts, and these re-repackaged debts, and then these split up tranches, and these re-repackaged split up tranches, went all over the place. And nobody cared, as long as you weren't the one holding the parcel at the end when the music stopped. Remember your kids? Do you remember being young and going to pass the parcel games at parties? Well, you probably did want to be the one that ended up with the parcel because that had the box of chocolates in it. But I mean, you understand the principle. And so we ended up with a banking system that completely reversed the polarities of everything we understood about banking. And the reason they got away with it was because nobody had the balls to stop them. This is my point about saying the regulators have completely failed. And they have failed, ladies and gentlemen, because the one message I want to leave with you this evening is this. The banking community now has long since bothered to equip itself and to engage with the rules by which they used to operate. And now the whole message is just get it off your books, move it around, the devil take the hindmost. And we are dealing with elements of business, and you've seen them yourselves. We've talked about the mis-selling. £20 billion worth of fraud. If that isn't organised crime, I'll eat my hat. And then we've got LIBOR manipulation. And we've probably seen in the papers that RBS, God help us, we own 80% of it. It's just about to be sued by an American institution called Fannie Mae. Major mortgage providers. Anybody stop to think that a major mortgage provider might be influenced by a fiddle insurance rate? Investment rate? No, never thought that one. So they're about to sue RBS. Oh, and they're going to win because it's in an American court. That's another debt that the poor old taxpayer is going to have to pick up. Won't stop them giving each other massive bonuses, of course, but that's neither here nor there, of course. No, we're not allowed to talk about those things. And then, of course, there's the drug money from Mexico. HSBC decided, well, nobody enforces the money laundering laws in this country, which is true, they don't. The FSA has the responsibility for enforcing it, but they don't bother. They wrote out a lovely paper a couple of years ago, June 2011. They published a paper saying, the banks aren't doing anything about money laundering. They didn't actually bother to prosecute anybody. They just said, oh, it's terrible. What are they doing about it? And consequently, HSBC decided, well, we might as well turn this into a business case. And so they bought themselves into a small bank in Mexico, which had fallen on hard times. Quite how you fall on hard times when you're moving all that drug money, I don't quite understand, but there I'm sure I could have done the job a lot better. And what they did was they re-registered that bank. You see, and then they re-registered that bank, and it became a 99.99% wholly owned subsidiary of a bank called HSBC Latin America. And HSBC Latin America is a 99.99% owned subsidiary of HSBC Canary Wharf. I don't know about you, but any bank that is owned 99.99% by somebody else is owned by the guy at the top. And there was Lord Sassoon going public and saying, when people were criticising the FSA for saying they had done nothing about this money laundering of all this rubbish, there's Lord Sassoon saying, oh, well, of course, you've got to understand that the FSA can't be blamed for this. No. This was a Mexican bank, and their authority doesn't extend to Mexico. Well, actually, apart from anything else, to start off with, under the law as it stands in this country, if a British institution engages in money laundering anywhere in the world, or if the proceeds from that money laundering anywhere in the world come through a British institution, we have authority to investigate it and prosecute it, as if the offence had been committed in the United Kingdom. It's written into the law. You'd think that Lord Sassoon, who is the Treasury Minister, you might think he'd know that, wouldn't he? And he also obviously hadn't bothered to look and see that it was a completely wholly owned subsidiary of HSBC. My point is this, my friends. We've now got ourselves into a stage, which is why I wrote in the report that I wrote, we are now in a stage where the British banking industry now is engaging in activities which are entirely synonymous with organised criminal enterprises. And we have to be aware of this. And one of the most difficult things, and Phil and I talked about this, one of the most difficult things that people have about getting their head round is the idea that bankers might be crooks.